My name's Terry Irwin. I'm one of the pastors here at Generations. Good to be with you all this morning. Good to have you all with us this morning. If you have a Bible with you, I'd invite you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8. We're going to be looking this morning at kind of the end of Matthew chapter 8, verses 28 through 34. Matthew 8, 28 through 34. And if you've hopefully been with us a little bit, or maybe this is your first time with us as we've been going through this, just kind of by way of reminder, you know, I think by now, Matthew's aim really here in chapter 8 is to provide us with a series of stories or encounters that really highlight Jesus' authority, right? So Jesus, he hasn't just come to teach, but he's come to demonstrate his authority as the Messiah and the King. And so Matthew is wanting us to see that, and he's walking us through a number of stories and encounters that really highlight the reality of Jesus' authority as the Messiah and King. And over the last few weeks, we've kind of considered the first two parts of what's really kind of a three-part kind of story here at the end of chapter 8. So in the first part of that story that we looked at a couple weeks ago, we saw Jesus as he was kind of finished healing and delivering a crowd from demonic possession outside Peter's home in Capernaum, that Jesus, you know, he finishes that work, and what does he do? He immediately commands his disciples to get up, to go, to leave the crowds, to leave Capernaum, to get into a boat in the middle of the night, to cross over the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and to go into another region. All right, it's a wild request, one that only Jesus could make. And then last week we saw what happened during that faithful journey across the Sea of Galilee as they were journeying across, and Jesus powerfully demonstrated his authority over the wind and the waves by calming that terrible storm that left the disciples cowering in fear for their lives. And so now as we come to our text this morning, we have kind of the resolution of that three-part story as we now find ourselves on the other side of that storm and on the other side of the sea where Jesus intended to go in the first place. And as Jesus steps off the boat, right, he wastes no time in getting to work. And I think in the events that are going to follow, Matthew gives us the details of a remarkable series of encounters that I think are once again going to demonstrate Jesus' authority as the Son of God in an unmistakable terms. Right? So as we look at this, you read along with me in Matthew 8, starting in verse 28, as we read from God's Word this morning. When he, Jesus, came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men met him, coming out of the tombs, so fierce that no one could pass that way. And behold, they cried out, "What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a herd of pigs was feeding at some distance from them, and the demons begged him, saying, "If you cast us out, send us away into the herd of pigs." And he said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the waters. The herdsmen of the pigs fled, and going into the city, they told everyone everything, especially what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, all the city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to leave their region. What an extraordinary way to close out this chapter. I mean, think about what's happened here. Matthew is turning our attention from Jesus' astonishing display of authority over the wind and the waves to another astonishing display of authority here on this side of the sea. And Matthew was keen, I think, over the last few weeks to show us that Jesus has authority over the physical world. Right? He can heal. He can command the wind and the waves. In our text this morning, though, Matthew, I think, is building on that picture by drawing our attention to another dramatic display of Jesus' authority in action. Only this time, the darkness is not physical but spiritual. Here on the other side of that fateful journey, in this encounter with these two demon-possessed men, Matthew wants us to see that Jesus has authority over spiritual darkness. That is the main idea that I think Matthew wants us to see here, that Jesus has authority over spiritual darkness. And to help us see this, Matthew, in telling this story, paints a vivid picture of Jesus' mission and his power and his authority over these demonic spirits. I think for Matthew, Jesus is nothing less than the conquering Messiah, one who has come to invade this domain of spiritual darkness as he powerfully dispels these forces of darkness, even while exposing the spiritual darkness of a people who are content to reject him. And I think as we work our way through this passage this morning, I think those kind of three aspects of the story are what we're going to look at. They'll serve as our three main points. And as we consider these main ideas, these main points, we'll look at this picture of Jesus as this messianic invader, when he was able to dispel the darkness. And we'll take some time to consider what this means for us, right? What does it mean that Jesus has this kind of authority over spiritual darkness? What does that mean for us? How does that challenge us and encourage us to come to Jesus in the midst of our own darkness? And how does that magnify our view of who Jesus is and what he is capable of doing in our own lives? And so one of the first things that we see in this story as Jesus steps off the boat is he's greeted by these two demon-possessed men. And I think it's clear from Matthew's description that this place is not a safe place. This is a place of great spiritual darkness that Jesus has entered into. Think about the way that Matthew describes this scene, right? Think about all the things that Matthew tells us. Not only is Jesus greeted by two demon-possessed men right off the boat, but he tells us that he is greeted by them in a place of death. They meet him coming up out of the tombs. These two demon-possessed men have made a cemetery their home. And that's the first place that Jesus goes to as he gets off this boat. Imagine if you're the disciples, right? This has already been a pretty wild ride. And you get off the boat, and Jesus starts making his way towards the cemetery. And you're thinking, what are we doing? But not only that, right? Matthew says this is not just some kind of eerie, spooky cemetery. No, there's real danger here. These men are so fierce and so violent and so dangerous, nobody in the area will go near this place. They've learned their lesson. When I was a kid, and I used to have to walk home from elementary school, between my elementary school and my house was a cemetery. And you could go sort of two ways. You could go around it through a street, and you could still get to our house, or you could go through it, and it was faster if you went through the cemetery. And I had a friend who was a neighbor, and we would walk home together. And when we walked home together, he never wanted us to go through the cemetery. It freaked him out. He said, I don't want to go through there. And this is in broad daylight with no demon-possessed men in sight. And yet he still did not want to cross over and go through the cemetery in the middle of the day. But this would have been his worst nightmare, because this is all of the things that he would be worried about come true. Right? It's possible this is still like early hours, maybe even dark. We don't know. But given the fact that it takes about 2 hours to cross the Sea of Galilee, it's still pretty early. And Jesus is heading towards this cemetery with two obviously demon-possessed men who are dangerous and violent. This is a difficult, scary situation. And to make things even more interesting, Matthew tells us that given the name of the region and the fact that there's pigs in the area, this is clearly a Gentile region. So like everything in the column of you shouldn't go here is stacked up. His disciples would have every reason in the world to think, what are we doing here? This is the last place in the world we should be. And I think Matthew's point is this is a place of great spiritual darkness. And yet Jesus doesn't care. He is happy. He is on a mission to invade this place of darkness. Right? This is no accident. Remember how this journey began back in verse 18. Jesus had finished casting out demons on one side of the sea, and now he's ready to go to the other side and do the same thing. He knows what he's doing. He has left Capernaum. He has given orders to the disciples to get in the boat in the middle of the night, to cross over the sea, to go through the storm, to head straight into this place. He knows exactly what he's doing and where he's going. He has come to this domain of darkness as a conquering invader. And Jesus has come to invade this place of darkness in order to demonstrate his authority over it. And I don't know about you, but friends, that's nothing short of epic. Like, I don't know how to describe that and use any other word to describe what Jesus is doing here. The determination that he has in this moment, the foresight to know this is where we need to go right now, the last place in the world anybody wants to go. I think it's a clear picture not just of what Jesus is determined to do here, but what Jesus is determined to do in coming to us in the first place. Jesus has come not just to one place of darkness, but he has entered into this world which lies in the domain of darkness. This is his mission, friends. Christ, as we sang about earlier, he has taken on flesh in order to shatter the darkness. That's what he has come to do. It's the very promise that God declared about the Messiah in Isaiah 60, verses 1 through 3. He said that this Messiah would come. He would shine the light of God's glory into the darkness. And that's exactly what is happening. Jesus is that conquering Messiah, the one who has come to invade the darkness and destroy it. And what does John tell us in 1 John chapter 3, verse 8 about the coming of Christ? Quote, "The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil." That's a pretty good mission statement for why Jesus has come. And that's exactly what he's doing in this story. He is invading this domain of darkness, entering into it, and he has come with all power and authority in the most dramatic possible way to show that he is going to destroy the works of darkness. And Jesus has come to do that for us, right? And those who are followers of him, we recognize that that is what he has done for us. He has invaded the darkness of our own lives, and he has freed us from that darkness so that we might worship him and glorify him. I think this passage, it's a reminder to us that Jesus has invaded the spiritual darkness of our lives, not just by saving us, but by continuing to shine the light of the gospel into our lives day after day as he lifts that darkness from our hearts and calls us into greater obedience to him. John says in 1 John 2:8, God's commands are true in us because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Like one of those commands that Jesus gives to us that shows that we walk in the light, as John will say, is that we want to join Jesus in this mission. We want to invade those places of darkness as well. We want to go with him like the disciples and see the darkness overcome the light. That's what Jesus himself told Paul in Acts 26:18 when he called him to go, just like Jesus did, into the land of the Gentiles, into their domain of darkness. Jesus told Paul, "I am sending you to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." Friends, God has called us similarly to join him in that work, to invade those places of spiritual darkness all around us, right? Are we willing to do that? I mean, are we willing to go to those places? It might not mean that we get on a boat and go to the most remote island possible. Maybe it does. Maybe it just means being willing to talk to that person we're afraid of, to have that conversation we don't want to have, to do that thing that seems dangerous and scary, but we know deep down this is what it would look like for me to enter this place of darkness and to speak the gospel. Maybe it means just being with somebody who makes you uncomfortable, sitting with someone as they struggle, sitting with another believer in their darkness, being able to bear with them in it as you minister the gospel to them. In all of these areas, we want to ask ourselves, are we willing to head into places of death and darkness and defilement and danger in order to share the gospel and to encourage others? I think if we are willing to do that, then I think we can ask, what hope do we have that that's going to actually do anything? Maybe if I go into these places, how do I know that God is going to actually do something? Well, I think our hope for that, it doesn't rest ultimately in our ability or in our authority, but in the one who is able to dispel the darkness and command those forces of spiritual darkness. And that's exactly what Jesus does here. He doesn't just enter into this place, but he dispels the darkness. Jesus doesn't have to wrestle these two men to the ground or overpower them. He doesn't have to go through some elaborate ritual to deal with this situation. As soon as they see Jesus, they cower before him. They cower before him. Notice how they immediately acknowledge his identity in verse 29. What have you to do with us, O Son of God? I don't know if you realize this. This is the first time in Matthew's gospel that Jesus' identity has been openly and clearly affirmed by anyone. By anyone. And yet, who is it that is acknowledging Jesus' authority and his identity here? Demons. Remember what we saw last week, right? Jesus had calmed the storm. His disciples have been given every indication of his power and authority. And what were they left doing? Scratching their heads, saying, who is this? What sort of man is this? And now, just a few verses later, right, they get their answer from demons. There's some deep irony in this. It's remarkable. What they failed to see, even when all the signs were there, these demons have been forced to declare at the mere sight of Jesus. The mere sight of him. They know exactly who he is. That's the kind of power and authority he has over them. They see him and they must immediately acknowledge who he is. And they don't just acknowledge his identity, but they're forced to acknowledge his authority over them, his authority to judge them. Look what they say at the end of verse 29. Have you come to torment us before the time? These demonic spirits, they're acknowledging two things with this question. One, there's an inescapable time of judgment coming for them. God has made that clear to them. They know that's happening. There is a time when God will deal with them once and for all and cast them and Satan into a place of eternal punishment and torment, something we read about, Revelation 20, verse 10. That's this time that they're referring to here. And it's inevitable. They know that. But they're also acknowledging something else. Jesus is the one who has the authority to cast them into that place. Not somebody else, but Jesus. Have you come to do this? They are terrified at the thought that that's exactly what Jesus has come to do, to torment them before the time. They thought they had more time, and now they saw Jesus, and they thought, oh no, our time is up. He's already here. I think in this question, it's a fearful acknowledgement of Jesus' authority, I think because they recognize that his presence signals the unstoppable reality that they will be judged. And that's exactly what they are worried about here. It's remarkable. These two demon-possessed men who made it impossible for anybody to pass by. So fierce, so terrifying, so awful, the most worst possible, scary, spooky situation you could imagine. And at the mere sight of Jesus, they've been brought to their knees in cowering fear. Not a single struggle, but full acknowledgement of his authority. They know that they cannot stop whatever it is Jesus has in store for them here. They know Jesus can do whatever he wants to us. There's nothing we can do. So what do? Well, they grovel and they beg. Look what Matthew says in verses 30 and 30 through 32. A herd of pigs was feeding at some distance from them, and the demons begged him, saying, if you cast us out, send us away into the herd of pigs. And he said to them, go. So they came and went out into the pigs, and behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the waters. And Jesus has come to dispel these forces of spiritual darkness, and they can't stop him. They know that. There's nothing they can do to stop whatever Jesus wants to do to them. They are powerless, absolutely powerless before him. The only thing they can do is beg him. Give us permission, please. These are two guys who were terrifying, and now they're asking for permission. And they have to obey his command to leave, these two poor men. And they beg him to grant them this request. Send us into that herd of pigs. We'll talk more in a minute about maybe why they ask this and why Jesus grants their request. I think for now it's just important to acknowledge the dynamic of authority and power at work here. It's remarkable. They're not just forced to leave these two men. They acknowledge that Jesus can say, you're done here. And they have to leave. But they're also forced to ask Jesus' permission about where they can go next. They don't simply say, all right, fine, Jesus, we're leaving. We'll go do whatever we need to do. No, they can't just leave and scurry to whatever host they want to go to next. That's not going to work. They know Jesus' authority extends far beyond these two men. And they know if they're going to have a home, Jesus has to be the one to permit them to do so. He has to grant them permission. He has to be the one to decide where they are allowed to go. Think about that. Think about that kind of authority that they are acknowledging that Jesus has over them. Please let us go over here and do this, Jesus. It's remarkable. This is a complete and total acknowledgement of Jesus' authority over them. Not just the authority to dispel them and send them out, but even to determine where they can and cannot go. And that's exactly what Jesus does. With a word. Go. Even get out is too long. Get out. No. Go. And they're forced to flee from these men into these pigs. I think as we step back and reflect on what this means for us, I think Jesus' encounter here with these evil spirits and the clear demonstration of his authority over them, I think it's both a warning and an encouragement to us. Like in one sense, like step back and remember how terrible this situation was before Jesus came into it. Like these two men are living in a cemetery. That's no place to be. And they are demon-possessed. This is an awful situation. I think there's a clear warning to us that there is a very real threat and power when it comes to these kinds of forces of spiritual darkness. They're not just a fantasy or something we see on TV. This is a real situation. And they had a real effect on these men's lives. A devastating one. We don't know exactly how they came to be in this position or what happened to these two men, but I think it's clear that something led them to this place where they found themselves this kind of oppression, this kind of possession even. And I think this is a warning to us. We might not find ourselves in the same place. Like it's probably pretty unlikely that next week I'm going to hear that one of you guys has run off to the cemetery, and maybe, hopefully not out here. Please don't do that. But yeah, we're probably not going to hear about that. And yet, I think we have to recognize that if we fail to take these things seriously, it has a real effect on us. We can open ourselves up to all kinds of spiritual oppression and opposition. And these spirits are not just real, but God's word tells us they are actively seeking to oppose not just Christ, but us as his people. Right? They are actively opposed to us. We can't just sort of ignore that reality and pretend like it doesn't exist. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to equip ourselves to withstand such opposition by turning to Christ and being strengthened in him to stand. That's exactly what Paul tells us to do in Ephesians 6:11. He exhorts us to put on the full armor of God. Right? That's not just a cute thing that he's saying. He says, do this. Why? So that we may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. We need to be equipped. We need to be armed to be able to withstand these things because they are actively seeking to oppose us. And I think this passage is a reminder of this struggle's real. These forces of darkness are actively seeking to oppose you, and they are no joke. Don't sleep on them. Like, they might not possess you or control you, but they are going to seek to discourage you and even devour your faith. But we can take heart, right? Because Jesus here, he shows us that we can be strengthened in the strength of his might, as Paul says in Ephesians 6, because he is the one who can dispel the forces of darkness with a mere word. We can't do it. We can't be bold enough to think, I'll stand against it, I'll be fine, I can do it. No, Jesus can, though. I think when we're feeling the weight of such opposition in our lives, It's crucial we don't ignore it, but it's also crucial that we don't fear it. It's crucial that we don't fear it. We don't need to stand on our own against these beings, but when we feel the weight of darkness in our lives, even maybe spiritual attack and oppression, turn to Christ. Turn to Him. Ask Him to help you and help you overcome these forces of darkness. He has that kind of authority. And think about how easily they bow before Him here. Why would we want to go on against them on our own? I think in many ways, though, if we wanted to tell this story, right? I think so far we've looked at it. It is amazing. I mean, it's truly amazing. The way in which Jesus has come as a conqueror. He's invaded this darkness. He has made these terrible, 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 almost monstrous creatures bow before Him and flee into the darkness and now into this water. And in many ways, like if I were to tell you this story, if I was going to be the one to tell you this story, I'd probably stop it right here. Say, that's good. That's a pretty good ending to the story. Like that's where I'd probably stop the story. Jesus has invaded the darkness. He's dispelled the forces of darkness, right? He's done. Things are taken care of. Moving on to the next story. Like the last thing we would want to do for Matthew is follow all that up with a series of perplexing details that end in Jesus being rejected by the very people He came to help, right? But that's exactly what Matthew does. He leaves us with a number of details that really seem to provide us with more questions than answers. I think we'll talk in a minute about why that may be, but I think it's just one thing to reflect on is I think as you see these kinds of things, just remember these aren't just sort of carefully crafted fairy tales. This is what happened. If you're Matthew, you are telling the story, and you're telling it with an intention to communicate something about who Jesus is, but you're also telling a true story about something that actually happened. So you don't feel the luxury, if you're Matthew, to just sort of pick and choose what you tell and don't tell. This really happened. Jesus was rejected even after all this. Look there at verses 33 through 34. The herdsmen fled, the herdsmen of the pigs, that is, and going into the city, they told everything, especially what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, all the city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw Him, they were really excited. No. They begged Him to leave their region. What? I mean, after all of this, after everything that Jesus has done, I mean, He has literally crossed hell and high water to get to them in the form of the sea and these demons. And instead of embracing Him as a hero, they reject Him and they beg Him to leave. What's going on here? I mean, what's the deal? Does this have something to do with the pigs? Did the demons make this request on purpose? Well, to be honest, we don't exactly know. Matthew doesn't really provide a lot of answers. He doesn't really tell us a lot of what's going on. But I think we can make some fairly educated guesses about why this situation went the way that it did, based on the details that Matthew does give us. I think when it comes to the demons, there's good reason to assume that their request was not an accident. They weren't just saying, okay, Jesus, there's some pigs. Maybe let us go over there. I don't know. That's no big deal. I think it's likely that there was a deliberate scheme in mind there. Again, it makes little sense for them to beg Jesus to enter into these pigs and then for them to immediately kill these hosts. It just wouldn't be a smart thing for you to do. In some ways, I think they were likely attempting to undermine Jesus' authority among these people, even as they were forced to obey that authority themselves. I think there is a deliberate scheme they have in mind here. And it's possible that this was exactly their plan, to sort of cause economic devastation in their wake, maybe hoping that will make up for the spiritual devastation that they're no longer able to ravage these people with. In the hopes that maybe these people in this region would see Christ as a greater threat than they are. And there's a good possibility that they were successful in that scheme. It's a good possibility that that was their plan and that that's exactly why Jesus is rejected here. We don't know why they asked Jesus to leave. They don't give us a reason. They don't say, we want you to leave because. We simply know that rather than revering Him for what He's done, they are afraid of Him. And they want Him to leave. possible that they saw him as an even greater threat. It's possible that they had realized, wow, these terrible, 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 evil demons have just, at a word, obeyed whoever this guy is. Maybe he's worse than they are. It's possible it's just simple fear over what they don't understand. But I think if that were the case, Jesus probably would have clarified who he was. Jesus would have been able to say, no, I'm not a demon. He's more than willing to do that in other occasions. I think it's possible that they feared the impact of what Jesus' miracles have done and might continue to do if he continues to do stuff like this. They might be afraid, what else are we going to lose? What else are the spiritual darkness that remains here? What else is that what other effect is that going to have on us? I think as many have noted, it's possible they simply cared more about pigs than these people. Or as one author says, they cared more about swine than the Savior. I think either way, Matthew intends for us to see their rejection of Jesus as a clear indication of the spiritual darkness of these people. Notice how Matthew uses the same word to describe both the demons' request and their request. Both of them begged Jesus. The demons begged Jesus to be able to leave on their own terms, and the people begged Jesus to leave on their terms. It's probably not a good thing here that Matthew is drawing such a clear parallel between these people and the demons. Probably not good. It's perhaps an indication of the spiritual darkness that's already at work in the lives of these people. After all, there's probably a reason why these men ended up in this position in the first place. Probably just didn't sort of happen on it. This is probably a place that is much deeper in darkness than even what we've seen on the surface. There's probably much, much spiritual darkness in this place. It's possible that demonic possession is a reflection of that. And I think their rejection certainly is. Like, we're meant to acknowledge that their rejection of Jesus, it's a reflection that they are already in a place of spiritual darkness. Their hearts are darkened. They have no desire to acknowledge who Jesus is. They simply want him to go away. But I think that begs the question, right? Pretty difficult question. If that's the case, why did Jesus go along with any of this? That's a hard question. Like I said, he has come through the sea, the storm. He's commanded his disciples to get in here. This is a very intentional thing that Jesus has done. He has come to demonstrate his authority in powerful ways. And yet, with just one simple permission, he allows potentially these demons to undermine his authority in the eyes of these people. Why? Again, I don't think Matthew tells us why Jesus allows this to happen. He doesn't give us a clear answer to that question. I think that's in one sense reflective of the fact that there are so oftentimes cases in our own life when Jesus allows things to happen to us that we don't understand, that just to us seem like that would be not how I would do it. And yet he doesn't give us answers sometimes. On the other hand, I think we have to say Jesus has not made a mistake here. He's not confused. He's not made a blunder. He's not just sleep deprived. Like, well, sorry, I was in the middle of the nap and they woke me up. I didn't realize what you were asking. I suspect Jesus is not caught off guard by this request. I suspect he was not caught off guard by their scheme. I think he was fully aware of it. I don't think he was surprised by the response of these people either. I think it's possible Jesus allowed all of this to happen exactly the way that it did in order to expose the spiritual darkness present here. One that's far deeper than just two men possessed by demons. One that goes far deeper than that because you have an entire people who are willing to reject him and turn him away. I think Jesus wants us to see that. He wants to expose that reality. And it's so important so far. We've seen people kind of flirting with that. It's going to be a thing that Matthew is really going to focus in on as he goes through his gospel. And especially as we get to the sort of 12th chapter, he's going to start drawing a really tight connection between those who are rejecting Jesus and demonic influence. And so it's no surprise here that he's already starting to kind of help us see that. But it's not just Jesus' own people who are capable of that. It's even these people here on the other side, these Gentiles. Jesus has come to deliver them from the darkness, but rather than being delivered, they chose to remain in darkness, to reject him in fear, to reject the only one who could rescue them from the darkness. They would rather remain in it than potentially move closer to him and try to find more about it. They don't even ask him any questions. They just say, please get out of here. And Jesus, he's not the one to cause them to reject him. It's not his fault. They choose to do that all on their own. But he didn't choose to stop it from happening. We have to wrestle with that reality. And I think he allows the situation to play out exactly as it does. Because I think even in this, even in allowing them to reveal their own darkness of their own hearts, I think Jesus is showing his authority over the darkness. He is not surprised in this situation or caught off guard. He knows exactly what he is intending to reveal here. And I think this is a sobering way to end the story. And we have to come to terms with that and accept that reality. Right? Again, we might want to end the story on that sort of glorious and triumphant note. That's not really how real life works often. It's not how God works in our own lives. This is a sobering reminder to us not only of God's grace towards us, but of the deep spiritual darkness that we once walked into. Paul says in Ephesians 2, 1 through 5, that we were once dead in our trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. We were like them, walking in that deep spiritual darkness. And yet, as Paul says, God being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he has loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace, you have been saved. By grace. And apart from God's grace towards us, we would reject Jesus just as these people did. That same darkness would be us. But God is rich in mercy, and he has not only invaded our darkness, but he's opened our eyes to see him for who he is. And that's a humbling thing. So you didn't do that. Jesus did that. If he didn't, you and I would be just like these people. And yet what a joyful thing it is to know that Jesus has done that for those of us who are followers of him. And if you don't know him, let me encourage you to see what these people failed to see. Ask God to open your eyes if you're struggling to see it. Don't be like them. Ask some questions. Ask some questions about who Jesus is and what he has come to do. Don't simply push him away. Don't continue to harden your heart against him and reject him. He has come to reclaim ruined sinners from the darkness, and he has lived a perfect life. He has died in our place in order to take on the wrath of God that we deserve because we walk in darkness. And yet, he promises that if you will turn to him, you will put your trust in him, turn from that darkness, you won't just be forgiven of your sin, you will be delivered from that darkness. You can be like the men in the story. Either you can be like those who were delivered by Jesus, or you can be like those who choose to reject Jesus and remain in darkness. I think if you don't know him, the choice is which one of those kind of people are you going to be? Are you going to be delivered, or are you going to reject him? My friends, Jesus has the authority to invade the spiritual darkness of our lives. And he has the authority to dispel that darkness with a word, because he's the one with complete authority over all spiritual darkness. And I hope as we reflect on this story that we're encouraged to come to him, to trust him, and to be strengthened by him. And we don't have to fear the darkness, right? We don't have to be afraid. We don't have to remain in it. We can be delivered from it. And if we're followers of Christ, I pray this week we're going to feel that darkness at times closing in. And when we do, I pray that we would look to this passage and we would be reminded at his authority. And we would not be afraid. We would cling closer to him. Would you bow your heads and pray with me? Would we confess that you are mighty, that you have come to lift that darkness and shame that we find ourselves in, that you have come powerfully and triumphantly to deliver us. And Jesus, we ask this morning that you would help us to see that clearly. Help us to see you clearly. Help us to worship you and rejoice, not just in what you have done for us, but who you are. One with this kind of power and authority over even the darkest and most terrible things in our lives. I pray that we would not fear this week, but that we would trust you. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Friends, we'll stand and sing together some more here in